Chapter 1, The Basement Archive. Dr. Margaret Chen had always found comfort in the smell of old paper. Not the acidic tang of decay, but that particular scent of manila folders aged just enough to soften at the edges, of typewritten pages that had witnessed decades without crumbling. It was the smell of institutional memory, and after 23 years at the Riverside Medical Research Foundation, she had come to associate it with stability itself. The foundation occupied a converted tuberculosis sanatorium on the outskirts of Portland, its brick facade still bearing the architectural optimism of the 1920s. Margaret's office was on the third floor, with windows that overlooked what had once been the patient's garden and was now a parking lot dotted with islands of ornamental grasses. She had never minded the view. The building's history didn't trouble her. She dealt in data, not ghosts. On the morning of October 15th, she arrived at 7:30 as always, her cloth shopping bag heavy with the lunch she'd packed and the journal articles she'd printed to read during her commute but hadn't opened. The security guard, Dennis, waved her through with the same slight nod he'd given her every weekday for the past 8 years. The elevator hummed its familiar off-key note. Everything was as it should be. Margaret's current project involved analyzing historical health outcomes from the Foundation's earliest studies. It was archival work, the kind that required patience and an eye for inconsistency. She was hunting through decades-old records for a meta-analysis that would likely never be published in any prestigious journal but would make an excellent reference document for future researchers. Modest work. Important work. The kind that suited her temperament. She had always been this way, even as a child in Sacramento, even during her graduate years at UCSF. While her colleagues chased breakthrough discoveries and competed for grants that would make their careers, Margaret had quietly built a reputation as someone who could be trusted with the tedious, essential tasks that formed the skeleton of good science. She knew where the bodies were buried, as her mentor used to say, though he'd meant it metaphorically, referring to her encyclopedic knowledge of the Foundation's filing systems and databases. The Foundation itself had been established in 1952 by a consortium of West Coast medical schools, initially focused on infectious disease research. Over the decades, its mandate had expanded and contracted like a lung, adapting to funding priorities and public health crises. Margaret had seen directors come and go, had watched entire departments dissolve and reform under new names. Through it all, the archives had remained, accumulating in the basement like sediment. That morning, she needed files from the mid-1960s, a period she'd been avoiding because the cataloging system had changed 3 times between 1964 and 1970, creating a labyrinth of cross-references that even she found challenging. But her analysis had a gap, and the gap bothered her with the persistence of a small stone in a shoe. The basement archive wasn't quite a basement. It was a sublevel, accessed by a stairwell that branched off from the main corridor on the ground floor. The door was marked Record Storage, Authorized Personnel Only, though in practice anyone with a staff ID could enter. The lights were motion-activated, fluorescent tubes that stuttered to life in sections as she descended, creating the disconcerting effect of walking into existence itself. The air was cooler here, regulated by the same climate control system that served the laboratory freezers. Margaret pulled her cardigan tighter. She'd been down here hundreds of times, knew the layout well enough to navigate between the tall metal shelving units without consulting the floor plan. The records were organized chronologically and then by department, with some additional sorting by principal investigator for the larger studies. She was looking for materials related to the Developmental Health Initiative, a 5-year program that had run from 1963 to 1968, tracking health outcomes in children from low-income families. It had been one of the Foundation's larger projects at the time, encompassing multiple sites across Oregon and Washington. Margaret had already reviewed the published papers, the final reports, the summary statistics. But there were discrepancies in the sample sizes that suggested incomplete data, and she needed the original intake forms to resolve them. The DHI files should have been in Section C, Range 4. She found the section easily, her fingers trailing along the shelf labels. But Range 4 seemed to contain only materials from 1969 and later. She frowned, double-checking the year markers. Had someone misfiled the boxes? She walked back to range 3, then range 5, scanning systematically. Nothing. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, their frequency just slightly wrong, creating a subliminal irritation. Margaret felt the first stirring of the frustration that came from systems failing to behave as expected. There was a desk near the entrance where the archive logs were kept, back when anyone had bothered to maintain them. She would check there, see if there was any notation about the DHI materials being moved or transferred. As she walked back toward the front of the archive, her eye caught on something she hadn't noticed before. At the far end of section C, there was a gap. Not a missing shelf, but a space between the last shelving unit and the wall that seemed wider than necessary. She approached it, curious. In the dimness beyond the last fluorescent fixture, she could make out what looked like a door. This was unusual but not unprecedented. The building had been modified many times over the decades, rooms divided and repurposed, hallways closed off and forgotten. She'd found odd spaces before, closets that led nowhere, bathrooms tiled over and sealed. But she'd never noticed this door, and she thought she knew every corner of the archive. The door was painted the same institutional green as the walls, which was perhaps why it had escaped her attention. There was no label, no room number, no window. Just a simple metal handle and a keyhole beneath it. Margaret tried the handle, not expecting it to turn. It turned. The door opened inward, and stale air breathed out at her, carrying a scent that was familiar yet wrong. Paper, yes, but also something chemical, something organic. The darkness beyond was absolute. She felt along the interior wall for a light switch, found one, flipped it. A single bulb illuminated a room perhaps 12 feet square. More shelving units, these ones older, wooden instead of metal. File boxes, dozens of them, their sides labeled in faded handwriting and typed labels yellowed with age. And something else, something that made Margaret's breath catch. Against the far wall, barely visible in the weak light, stood what looked like medical equipment. An examination table, its leather surface cracked. Cabinets with glass doors, their contents shadowed. And instruments, arranged on a rolling cart, their metal dulled but still recognizable. This was not just a storage room. Margaret stepped inside, her practical shoes soundless on the concrete floor. The nearest file box was labeled DHI, Intake Forms 1963 to 1964, Subjects 001-100. She had found what she was looking for. But why were these files here, separated from the main archive, stored in a room that appeared on no floor plan she'd ever seen? She lifted the lid of the box. Inside, intake forms filled out in triplicate, carbon copies still attached. She recognized the format, the familiar bureaucratic questions. Child's name. Date of birth. Parent or guardian. Address. Medical history. Consent signature. Everything was in order. Everything was as it should be. Except that it was here, in this hidden room, and not where it belonged. Margaret set the lid back carefully. Her eyes adjusted further to the dim light, and she saw more clearly now what filled the shelves. Not just intake forms. Progress reports. Medical examinations. Laboratory results. And photographs, entire boxes of photographs, their edges visible through gaps in deteriorating cardboard. She should leave. She should report this discovery to the Foundation's administration, let them determine what this room was and why it existed. She should follow protocol. But Margaret had spent 23 years following protocol, and she had learned that institutional memory was often institutional amnesia, that what was filed away was often filed away for a reason. And she had also learned that the truth, when it was hidden, was worth finding. She reached for the second file box, labeled DHI, Progress Reports 1964 to 1965, and as she did, the fluorescent light in the archive outside stuttered once, twice, then steadied. In that brief flicker of darkness, Margaret Chen understood that she had found something that was never meant to be found. And she knew, with the certainty that comes from years of careful observation, that her life had just become considerably more complicated. Chapter 2, The Extension. Margaret didn't tell anyone about the room. Not that day, nor the day after. She told herself it was because she needed to understand what she'd found before raising alarms, that premature disclosure would only create confusion. But in the quiet moments of her evening routine, heating soup, folding laundry, sitting with a book she wasn't reading, she acknowledged a less professional truth: she wanted to know first. She wanted to understand before the discovery was taken from her and sanitized by committees. She returned to the hidden room during her lunch hour, when the archive was least likely to have visitors. The Foundation staff rarely ventured into the basement except to retrieve specific files, and fewer still during the midday lull when most people ate at their desks or drove to the sandwich shops on Hawthorne Boulevard. The room revealed itself slowly, box by box. The Developmental Health Initiative had indeed concluded in 1968, exactly as the published record indicated. The final report, which Margaret had read years ago during a different project, had been comprehensive and unremarkable. The study had tracked 500 children from low-income families across the Pacific Northwest, monitoring their physical and cognitive development, their nutrition, their exposure to environmental hazards. The findings had contributed to several policy recommendations and had been cited in subsequent research. Clean. Complete. Finished. Except it hadn't finished. The files in the hidden room told a different story. In December of 1968, 3 months after the official conclusion of the DHI, a memo had been circulated to a select group of researchers. Margaret found it paper-clipped to the inside cover of a binder labeled Phase 2, Internal Only. The memo was brief, typed on Foundation letterhead, signed by Dr. Howard Reeves, who had been the director of research at the time. Given the unique longitudinal dataset established by the DHI, the memo read, and the availability of continued funding through private channels, we propose extending observation of the study cohort for an additional 5-year period. This extension will be conducted with minimal additional burden to subjects and will focus on long-term developmental outcomes not previously examined. To maintain consistency with the original study design and to avoid confounding effects from subject awareness, we recommend continuing without formal reconsent, utilizing existing authorization. Margaret read the memo 3 times, her legal training from an undergraduate flirtation with pre-law raising immediate objections. Continuing without formal reconsent. The phrase was carefully chosen, bureaucratically vague, and deeply troubling. The original consent forms had authorized participation in a 5-year study. Using that authorization to justify an extension, especially one conducted in secret, was ethically questionable at best. But it was the final sentence that made her hands cold: all materials related to Phase 2 should be maintained separately from general archives to avoid clerical confusion. This room wasn't an oversight. It was intentional. She opened the binder. Inside were continuation forms, tracking the same children who had participated in the original study. Now they were older, 8, 9, 10 years old by the time Phase 2 began. The forms documented school performance, behavioral assessments, medical examinations. Nothing that seemed immediately harmful. Annual checkups, vision tests, dental records. The kind of data that might be valuable for long-term health research. Margaret moved to the next binder. Phase 3, 1973 to 1978. Her stomach tightened. Another extension. Another 5 years. The children were teenagers now, the data more complex. Psychological evaluations. Academic transcripts. And something new, biological samples. Blood draws. Tissue samples. Stored and analyzed for purposes the forms described only as baseline establishment for future comparative studies. She found Phase 4. Phase 5. The study had continued, in secret, for decades. The last entries were dated 2003, 40 years after the original study began, 35 years after it had supposedly ended. By then, the children were middle-aged adults, many with children of their own. Some had died. Some had moved away, disappeared from the records. But others had been tracked with remarkable persistence, their lives documented in intervals, their data harvested without their knowledge. Margaret sat on the cold concrete floor, her back against the metal shelving, surrounded by boxes that contained the hidden history of 500 lives. She thought of the families who had enrolled their children in a health study in 1963, trusting that the foundation would help their communities, that 5 years of cooperation would contribute to something meaningful. She thought of those children, now in their 60s, unaware that their medical histories, their school records, their biological samples had been collected and analyzed for 4 decades. The room seemed smaller now, the air thicker. She noticed details she'd missed before. The examination table had restraint straps, cracked and stiff with age. The cabinets contained jars, their labels faded but still partially legible. Specimen, subject 247 to 1976. The instruments on the cart were surgical, precise, designed for procedures more invasive than simple blood draws. What had they done? Margaret stood, her knees protesting. She was 51 years old, methodical, careful, not given to dramatics. But she felt something unfamiliar rising in her chest, something that might have been anger or might have been fear. She had spent her entire career at this foundation, had believed in its mission, had trusted its integrity. She opened another box, this one containing photographs. Black and white images, then color as the decades progressed. Children in examination rooms, their faces carefully angled to obscure identity but their body language unmistakable. Anxiety. Confusion. In some of the later photographs, resistance. Teenagers who clearly didn't want to be there, who were being examined anyway. One photograph made her stop. A boy, perhaps 14, sitting on an examination table. His face was turned away from the camera, but his hands were visible, gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Behind him, partially out of frame, stood a figure in a white coat, holding what looked like a syringe. Margaret checked the back of the photograph. Subject 089, Phase 4 Intake, 1978. She cross-referenced the subject number with the files. Subject 089, male, enrolled in original DHI at age 4, continued through all subsequent phases. Last recorded contact, 2003. Status, deceased, 2007. Cause of death, noted in records but file marked See Addendum. She searched for the addendum. Found it in a separate folder, a thin sheaf of papers that documented not just Subject 089's death, but the deaths of 37 other study subjects. The causes varied: cancer, heart disease, accidents, suicide, but someone had been tracking them, noting them, analyzing mortality rates. And in the margin of the summary page, a handwritten note in pencil: excess mortality versus control pop. Statistically significant. Further analysis pending. The fluorescent bulb overhead flickered, and Margaret realized she'd been in the room for nearly 2 hours. Her lunch was still in her office, uneaten. She had a meeting at 2 o'clock. She needed to return to the world above, to pretend that everything was normal. But as she carefully replaced the files, ensuring everything was exactly as she'd found it, Margaret Chen understood that normal was over. She had discovered something that powerful people had worked hard to hide, and she would have to decide what to do with that knowledge. The decision felt impossibly heavy, but also strangely clarifying. For the first time in 23 years, she knew exactly what her work meant. Chapter 3, The Living Subjects. Margaret spent the weekend in a state of controlled paralysis. She cleaned her apartment with unusual thoroughness, organized her spice rack alphabetically, repotted the plants on her balcony. Her hands stayed busy while her mind circled the same questions. Who knew? Who had authorized this? And most urgently, were they still watching the subjects? The last entry had been 2003, 22 years ago. But that didn't mean the study had truly ended. It might only mean that record-keeping had moved elsewhere, had gone digital, had found new hiding places. On Monday morning, she arrived early and went straight to the Foundation's personnel database. Dr. Howard Reeves, the director who'd signed that first extension memo, had died in 1991. She traced the succession of research directors through the decades. Some had retired, some had moved to other institutions, one had died in a car accident in 1989. But 3 researchers who had signed documents in that hidden room were still alive, and one still worked at the Foundation. Dr. Patricia Mercer, now 73, listed as Senior Research Consultant, office on the 2nd floor. Margaret had seen her in the halls occasionally, a tall woman with steel-gray hair who carried herself with the certainty of someone who'd spent decades making decisions others simply implemented. They'd never worked together directly. Their research areas had never intersected. Until now. Margaret didn't approach her. Not yet. Instead, she returned to the hidden room with a different purpose. She needed to know if any of the subjects were traceable, if any could be contacted. The thought of reaching out to them terrified her. What would she say? How would she explain? But it felt necessary, an obligation that grew heavier each day. The final phase, Phase 5, had tracked approximately 200 subjects, the remainder of the original 500. Margaret cross-referenced names and dates of birth, then began searching public records, obituaries, social media. It was easier than she'd expected. People left digital trails now, breadcrumbs scattered across the internet. Subject 156, Janet Pritchard, née Holbrook. Age 62. Living in Eugene, Oregon. Worked as a dental hygienist. Married, 3 children, active on Facebook where she posted pictures of her grandchildren and complained mildly about her book club selections. Subject 203, Michael Chen, no relation to Margaret, though the shared surname gave her a strange jolt. Age 61. Living in Seattle. Owned a small restaurant in the International District. Recent posts showed him at a Mariners game, grinning under a baseball cap. Subject 247, the specimen jar she'd seen. Sarah Duvall. Age 60. More difficult to find, but Margaret located her eventually through a trail of addresses. Living in Portland, actually, in a small house near Reed College. Worked at a nonprofit providing services to adults with developmental disabilities. They were real. Not just numbers, not just data points. Living people with ordinary lives, unaware that somewhere in a hidden room, their childhoods had been catalogued, their bodies sampled, their futures analyzed for patterns and anomalies. Margaret photographed pages from the files with her phone, her hands shaking slightly. She knew this was dangerous, that she was crossing lines, but she needed evidence that existed outside this room, insurance against the possibility that everything here might disappear. On her 4th visit to the room, she found the financial records. They'd been filed separately, in boxes she'd initially overlooked because they were labeled only with years, not the DHI designation. But the years corresponded, 1968 forward, continuing to 2003. The funding hadn't come from the Foundation's general operating budget. It had come from a private foundation she'd never heard of, the Riverside Trust. The amounts were substantial, hundreds of thousands of dollars annually, all directed to a restricted account accessible only to the principal investigators. The trust's address was a P.O. box in Delaware. She photographed these documents too, though she had no idea what they proved beyond the obvious. Someone with money had wanted this study to continue, had paid for secrecy, had considered the knowledge worth the ethical compromise. But what knowledge? That was what Margaret couldn't understand. The data collected seemed mundane, the kind of information that could be gathered through conventional longitudinal studies with proper consent. Why the secrecy? What were they actually looking for? The answer was in a filing cabinet she'd assumed contained only equipment manuals. Inside, she found research proposals, grant applications to the Riverside Trust, documents that outlined the true purpose of the extended phases. Phase 2 had been sold as a study of long-term effects of early childhood nutrition interventions. But the proposal revealed something else, The researchers had been testing a hypothesis about biological markers of cognitive development, specifically whether certain genetic variations correlated with educational outcomes. They'd been looking for eugenic patterns, though they were careful never to use that word. Phase 3 and beyond had grown more ambitious. They'd begun collecting family histories, tracking siblings and eventually children of the original subjects. They were building a multigenerational dataset, trying to identify hereditary patterns in intelligence, behavior, susceptibility to disease. The kind of research that had been discredited publicly but apparently continued in private, funded by people who believed in biological determinism and wanted scientific justification. Margaret sat in the dim room, surrounded by decades of unethical research, and felt the weight of choice pressing down on her. She could walk away, return these files to their boxes, close the door, and pretend she'd never found it. The study was over, the subjects were fine, and exposing this would only cause pain without preventing future harm. Or she could bring it into the light. That evening, she composed an email to Janet Pritchard, subject 156. She drafted it a dozen times, deleting each version. How do you tell someone their childhood was a lie? Finally, she wrote simply, "My name is Dr. Margaret Chen. I work at the Riverside Medical Research Foundation in Portland. I've discovered records indicating you participated in a research study as a child, and I believe there are aspects of that study you weren't informed about. If you're willing to speak with me, I'd like to explain what I've found." She stared at the draft for 20 minutes, her finger hovering over the send button. Once she did this, there would be no taking it back. The foundation would discover what she'd done. Dr. Mercer would know someone had found the room. Her career would end, possibly her freedom if they chose to prosecute her for unauthorized access to confidential records. But in her mind, she kept seeing that photograph, the boy with white knuckles gripping the examination table, and she thought of him as an adult, as the man who died in 2007, never knowing why his mortality had been deemed statistically significant. Margaret pressed send. Then she sent emails to Michael Chen, to Sarah Duvall, to 15 other subjects she'd been able to locate. Not all at once, she spaced them over an hour, trying to make it seem less coordinated, less threatening. Just a researcher reaching out, asking questions. By the time she finished, her hands were trembling so badly she had to clasp them together. She'd just initiated something she couldn't control, set in motion forces she couldn't predict. In the morning, she would find out what those forces were. Chapter 4, The Confrontation. The first response came at 6:47 the next morning, while Margaret was still in her kitchen, staring at coffee she'd forgotten to drink. Janet Pritchard had written back, "I remember the study. They told us it ended when I was 9. What do you mean there are aspects I wasn't informed about? Please call me." A phone number followed. Margaret's hands shook as she dialed. Janet answered on the second ring, her voice cautious but curious. Margaret explained carefully, choosing words that conveyed truth without sensationalism. The study had continued after the official end date. Records had been kept without renewed consent. Medical information had been collected, analyzed, stored. How long? Janet asked. Her voice had changed, gone flat. Until 2003. A long silence. Then, I'm 52 years old. They were tracking me until I was 52 years old. Yes. Another silence, longer this time. When Janet spoke again, her voice was harder. I need to see these records. I have a right to see them. I know, Margaret said. I'm trying to figure out how to make that happen. Who else knows about this? No one yet. Just you. And the others I contacted. How many others? 15. Jesus. A pause. Do they know you're doing this? The foundation? Not yet. They will soon. Janet's voice carried a certainty that made Margaret's stomach tighten. My cousin works in medical records at OHSU. She's always telling me about privacy violations, how seriously they take unauthorized access. If you're reaching out to subjects, using information from confidential files, they'll find out. Margaret knew this. She'd known it when she sent the emails. But hearing it stated so plainly made it real in a way it hadn't been before. "I'm willing to face the consequences," Margaret said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. "Good," Janet said. "Because I'm going to need someone to face them with me. I'm calling a lawyer today. And I'm going to want you to testify about what you found." By noon, Margaret had received responses from 7 subjects. All of them were angry. All of them wanted answers. Michael Chen's email was particularly pointed. "My parents trusted these people. They thought they were helping us. What gave them the right to turn us into lab rats?" Margaret was composing a response when her office phone rang. The Foundation's general counsel, Richard Vasquez, asked if she could come to the director's office immediately. His tone was professionally neutral, but Margaret heard the edge beneath it. She'd known this moment was coming. She'd prepared for it, mentally rehearsed what she would say. But walking through the halls toward Director Elizabeth Brennan's office, she felt her preparation dissolving, leaving only raw nervousness. Dr. Patricia Mercer was already there, sitting in one of the leather chairs across from Brennan's desk. She looked at Margaret with an expression that might have been disappointment or might have been something colder. Richard Vasquez stood by the window, arms crossed. Director Brennan gestured to the empty chair. "Dr. Chen. Thank you for coming. I understand you've been accessing archival materials related to the Developmental Health Initiative." "Yes," Margaret said. "As part of my current research project." "And you found something concerning?" It wasn't a question. Margaret nodded. "Rather than bringing your concerns to administration," Brennan continued, "you chose to contact former research subjects directly. Using confidential information obtained through your position here. I contacted people about a study they participated in. A study that continued for decades without their knowledge or consent." Dr. Mercer spoke for the first time, her voice measured and calm. "The study operated under the ethical guidelines of its time. Consent standards have evolved, yes, but we can't retroactively apply modern standards to historical research. The study didn't end in 1968, Margaret said, keeping her voice level. It was deliberately extended in secret. That's not an ethical guideline issue. That's fraud. That's a very serious accusation, Vasquez said from the window. It's a very serious situation. Brennan folded her hands on her desk. Dr. Chen, I'm going to be direct. The Foundation has worked for 70 years to build a reputation for scientific integrity. What you're doing threatens that reputation based on your interpretation of records you accessed without authorization. I had authorization to access the archives. You had authorization to access catalog materials relevant to your research. Not to enter sealed storage areas. Not to photograph confidential documents. Vasquez held up his phone, showing an image. Margaret recognized her own phone number in a metadata report. Our IT security flagged unusual photo activity from your device on Foundation premises. Standard protocol. They've been watching. Of course they've been watching. The subjects have a right to know, Margaret said. The subjects, Dr. Mercer said, her voice sharpening, are being needlessly alarmed about research that harmed no one and contributed significantly to our understanding of developmental health outcomes. You're creating a crisis where none exists. 37 subjects died at rates higher than the general population. Someone noted it was statistically significant. That suggests harm. Mercer's expression flickered, just slightly. Correlation isn't causation. You know that. Then let's examine the causation. Release the full records. Let independent researchers review the data. If there was no harm, transparency will prove it. That's not your decision to make, Brennan said. No, Margaret agreed. But it's not yours either. It's theirs. The people who were studied without their knowledge. They get to decide what happens to their own medical information. The room fell silent. Through the window, Margaret could see the parking lot, the ornamental grasses moving in the wind. Ordinary world, continuing obliviously. "We're placing you on administrative leave," Brennan said finally. "Effective immediately. You'll surrender your ID badge and your access to Foundation systems. HR will contact you about next steps." Margaret had expected this. She nodded, removed her badge from its lanyard, and placed it on the desk. "The subjects I contacted," she said, standing. "They're hiring lawyers. They're going to request their files under medical privacy laws. You can suspend me, but you can't make this go away." "We're not trying to make anything go away," Vasquez said. "We're protecting the Foundation's interests while determining the facts. The facts are in the basement. In a room that's not on any floor plan. In files that were deliberately hidden." Dr. Mercer stood as well, her tall frame imposing. "You have no idea what you've done. That research represented decades of careful work. Important work. And you're destroying it because of some misguided moral crusade." Margaret looked at her directly. "People aren't research materials. They're people. And they deserve to know what was being done to them." She walked out before anyone could respond, her legs steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. In the elevator, alone, she let herself shake. She'd just ended her career, possibly opened herself to legal action, certainly made enemies of powerful people. But when she reached the ground floor and stepped outside into the October afternoon, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. She felt certain. Chapter 5, The Accounting. The lawsuit took 18 months to reach settlement. Margaret wasn't a plaintiff, she'd lost that right when she signed the separation agreement the Foundation had offered in exchange for not prosecuting her for unauthorized access to confidential materials. But she testified, spending 3 days in a conference room describing what she'd found, walking attorneys through the boxes and files and photographs that had finally been brought into the light. The hidden room had been emptied within a week of her suspension. She'd expected that. But Janet Pritchard's lawyer had moved quickly, filing an injunction that required the Foundation to preserve all materials related to the DHI. The files had been moved, but they still existed, and that was what mattered. In the end, 217 former subjects joined the class action. Some had died, some couldn't be located, some simply didn't want to relive their childhoods by engaging with the lawsuit. But 217 was enough. The Foundation settled for $12 million, paid into a fund distributed among the living subjects. It wasn't about the money, most of them said in interviews. It was about acknowledgement. About someone finally admitting that what had been done to them was wrong. Dr. Patricia Mercer retired abruptly, 3 months after the lawsuit was filed. She gave no interviews, released no statement. Margaret saw her once, at a distance, at a conference the following year. Their eyes met across the hotel lobby, and Mercer looked away first. The Riverside Trust, when investigated, turned out to be a shell entity funded by 3 wealthy families with a history of supporting eugenic research. The Foundation returned all remaining funds from that source, nearly $2 million that had sat untouched in restricted accounts for over a decade. The money was donated to community health centers in the neighborhoods where the original subjects had lived. Margaret never worked in medical research again. She'd known she wouldn't, had accepted that loss before she sent those first emails. For a while, she worked as a data analyst for a nonprofit focused on research ethics. Then she retired early, at 54, and moved to a smaller apartment with a better view. But she stayed in touch with some of the subjects. Janet Pritchard called her every few months, usually to talk about nothing in particular, grandchildren, book club, the persistent raccoon problem in her neighborhood. Once, she said, "You know, I always felt like something was off. Like there was this shadow following me. Now at least I know what it was." Michael Chin invited her to his restaurant, insisted she eat for free, introduced her to his daughters as the woman who told the truth. They talked for hours about his parents, who died before the lawsuit, never knowing what had happened. "I wish they could have known," he said. "I wish they could have fought for me themselves." Sarah Duval, subject 247, whose tissue sample Margaret had found in that jar, never responded to any outreach. Margaret worried about her, wondered if the revelation had been too much, too painful. Then one day, 2 years after the settlement, a letter arrived. "Dear Dr. Chen," it read. "I needed time to process everything. I still don't fully understand why they did what they did, or what they were looking for in my blood, my cells. But I wanted you to know that finding out was better than not knowing. The not knowing was its own kind of harm. Thank you for taking that away. Sarah." The Foundation issued a formal apology, commissioned an independent ethics review, implemented new oversight protocols. Director Brennan resigned. New leadership promised transparency, accountability, a renewed commitment to ethical research. Margaret read the press releases with cynical detachment. Institutions didn't change easily. They protected themselves first, reformed only under pressure, and even then, only as much as necessary. But she also knew that the hidden room was empty now, its contents catalogued and accessible. That was something. 5 years after she'd first opened that unmarked door, Margaret received an invitation to speak at a conference on research ethics. She almost declined. She wasn't academic anymore, wasn't current on the literature, wasn't sure she had anything useful to say. But the invitation came from a graduate student who'd written her thesis on the DHI case. "You changed the conversation," the student wrote. Before this, historical research ethics violations were treated as distant problems, mistakes from a less enlightened time. "You showed that the past isn't actually past, that secrets can persist for decades, and that one person noticing something wrong can make a difference." Margaret accepted. Standing at the podium, looking at an audience of young researchers, she didn't talk about heroism or moral courage. She talked about the smell of old paper, about spending 23 years building expertise in systems and archives, about how that expertise had made her the only person who would notice a door that shouldn't exist. "I wasn't special," she said. "I was just paying attention. And when I found something wrong, I had to decide whether my comfort mattered more than other people's right to know what had been done to them." She paused, gathering her thoughts. The study subjects didn't get their childhoods back. They didn't get justice, not really. What they got was acknowledgement, and access to their own records, and the knowledge that what happened to them mattered enough for someone to risk something to tell the truth about it. She looked at the faces in the audience, some taking notes, some just listening. "That's all any of us can do," she said. "Pay attention. Tell the truth. Accept the consequences." After the talk, several students approached with questions. One asked if she regretted losing her career. Margaret considered this carefully. "I regret that it was necessary," she said finally. "But no, I don't regret the choice." That evening, back in her apartment, Margaret stood on her balcony watching the city lights emerge as dusk deepened. Somewhere out there, 217 people were living their lives, knowing now what had been taken from them, what had been hidden, what was finally revealed. The knowledge didn't undo the harm. But it was something. And sometimes, Margaret thought, something was enough. She went inside, made tea, and sat with a book she was actually reading this time. The story of the hidden study would continue without her now, would be analyzed in dissertations and ethics courses, would serve as a cautionary tale for future researchers. But for Margaret Chen, it was finished. She had found what was lost. She had spoken what was silenced. And in the end, that was the only accounting that mattered.